A lot of the books of the Old Testament are purported to tell the history of the Israelites. We got, personalities. We got King David, King Solomon, various famous prophets and nation builders, etc. When were these figures, and maybe let's stick with King David, supposed to live? And is there any archaeological evidence testifying to the existence of any of these figures?
So so King David is right around the year 1000 BCE, and the earliest kind of evidence that we have for the existence of a historical David is that Tel Dan Stele I mentioned earlier, because I mentioned that Hazael boasts about having defeated some Israelite kings, and then he mentions the name of a Judahite ruler and says that they're of the house of David. Beit Dawid. And so this is not a kingdom. It's not mentioned as a kingdom or a nation or anything like that. It's mentioned more as kind of a dynasty. And so this is interpreted by most scholars as evidence that at least, 150 years after David was supposed to have lived, they knew about some kind of dynasty known as the House of David. And so that may be indirect historical evidence that somebody named David established a dynasty in the southern area of Judah around Jerusalem. And so some scholars reconstruct the start of the kingdom of Judah as maybe David tried to take over the throne from Saul in Israel and failed, and so went down south and took over Jerusalem and started up his own little chiefdom down there. And that turned into the kingdom of Judah, and he became King David. But initially it was just a dynastic house. So that's the earliest evidence that we have for any kind of historicity that we might attribute to the historical timeline there. Now, I mentioned some Israelite kings. I mentioned Moab, mentioned some Israelite kings. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser, the third, mentions Jehu. So that's where we first get independent attestation of people mentioned in the Bible, contemporary with the people themselves. So that would be the earliest direct evidence for their existence. And so it's right around that time period between 850 and 800 BCE that we begin to see direct historical attestation of these figures. And so what I normally say is, more or less roughly around the time period of David, the text is going to be, in very broad strokes, accurate in terms of who's ruling where. That there probably was a Solomon of some kind. It was not a gigantic kingdom that put to shame everybody around them. It was probably a little chiefdom, but we get folks like Jeroboam and Rehoboam and the Omride dynasty and Jehu and Hazael and all these other folks. And those are probably historical figures. Now, all the stories that are being told about them, particularly that involve supernatural events, we have no data that support their historicity, and particularly where they conflict. But in terms of the names of rulers of nations, that begins to be historically accurate right there in the 9th century BCE. And most scholars would say that some of the early prophetic literature was probably written by people who were itinerant prophets who went around condemning the wealthy and the privileged for their oppression of the poor and the needy. So a handful of chapters in the first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah are attributed to a historical Isaiah who lived in the 8th century BCE. And Hosea and Micah and Amos and others are examples of other prophetic figures that scholars think probably existed and preached around that time period as well.
That's more than I would have thought. I thought none of these folks actually existed. So a little bit of props there to the Old Testament.
Yeah, when we look at the Pentateuch, when we look at Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Judges, that's all very much not supported by any data.
Okay,
so,
that was my next question, actually,
yeah.
About the Exodus, one of the most obviously striking and famous stories of the Old Testament. Moses leading the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery. Do Egyptian records confirm the historicity of this narrative at all, or at least a portion of it? What about...
Not at all.
Okay,
Not even a little bit.
I'm gonna go lowest common kind of denominator. Were there Jewish slaves in Egypt at all at any point?
We have to be a little pedantic here. Jewish is a designation that wouldn't have existed at that time period. We probably can't speak of Jewish until we get down to 2nd century BCE. However, their ancestry, maybe. There were certainly Semitic peoples who were enslaved by the nation of Egypt and in Egypt. And there were actually Semitic peoples who ruled Egypt for a time, known as the Hyksos. So there were always there was always influence back and forth between Egypt and Semitic peoples, and they referred to them as the Asiatics in the Egyptian texts. We have absolutely no data whatsoever that indicate anyone from the northern hill country of Israel had been enslaved in Egypt and escaped. However, there are some theories that this tradition about this escape from slavery might be rooted in some kind of historical kernel where maybe a small group of people escaped and came back and started telling their story. And over the centuries, the fish just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it turned into what we have now. There's one scholar whose theory is that the tribe of Levi, the Levites, that was the tribe that escaped out of Egypt and made their way, and they're the ones who preserved the story, and they're the ones who passed it on. So that's one theory. Other scholars think that it originates in a social memory about a group escaping from slavery within the northern hill country itself. They didn't run off from another nation. They were enslaved by their neighbors, and the story just, again, grew and grew and grew into what we have now. But those are rather speculative reconstructions of what's going on. They're plausible, but we don't have enough data to be able to say one way or another they did or didn't happen. So that's part of the academic endeavor. We got to try and take some steps in the dark from time to time, and then see if maybe we discover data that allows us to confirm or deny any of those theories.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing to Smart Cookies on YouTube. What else is there? Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you really liked what you heard, feel free to become my patron on Patreon by going to Patreon and becoming my patron. It's really easy. Just type Smart Cookies Podcast in there. You should be able to find me. Last but not least, I have to thank the absolute legends that are my producers on this show, my existing patrons on Patreon: Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Gordon, Jurechuk, Lorenzo, Mila, Carmen, Taichi, Goran, and Veronica. Without you guys, this show wouldn't exist. So massive thanks. And yeah, see you in the next episode. Bye.